I guess I just have to say one thing about the gospel. Rejoice when you're persecuted, okay? That's what Jesus says, all right? We continue with our Discernment of Spirits Mondays, and I noticed that last week, I believe I kept referencing Rule 5, but we were already in Rule 6. So if I did do that, that's a mistake. We're talking about Rule 6. So just to recap the last two rules, Rule 5, right, is spiritual desolation, a time for fidelity, right? Not changing our commitments with the Lord, spiritually speaking, when we can't see clearly because of spiritual desolation. And then Rule 6 is spiritual desolation, a time for initiative, right? We talked about 4 things we can do to kind of fight back: prayer, meditation, much examination, and then suitable penance. So today we can start with Rule 7, and we could give it the title of Spiritual Desolation, a time for resistance. A time for resistance. And one of the different things between rule number 7 and the previous 2 is that the previous 2 have to do with kind of change, right? Like Rule 5, don't do a change, and then Rule 6 kind of change insofar as like initiative. Kind of has to do with action, these 2 rules. Don't do action in regards to don't change things you've committed, and then like do action as a way of fighting. Rule 7, more than like action, has to do regarding a way of thinking. All right, so we'll notice this. It's a way of thinking that can help us fight spiritual desolation. So let me read the rule. 7th rule, the 7th. Let one who is in desolation consider how the Lord has left him in trial in his natural powers, so that he may resist the various agitations and temptations of the enemy. Since he can resist with the divine help, which always remains with him, though he does not clearly feel it. For the Lord has taken away from him his great fervor, abundant love, and intense grace, leaving him, however, sufficient grace for eternal salvation. So, if you notice there at the beginning, it says, let one who is in desolation consider, ... right? Consider. So this has to do with a way of thinking, considering something for the sake of helping you fight desolation. And there's 3 main things that he wants you to consider in this rule, St. Ignatius does. First is just to consider that what you're going through is a trial, right? Consider how the Lord has left him in trial, right? And the second thing he invites us to consider is the nature of the trial. You are kind of, quote-unquote, left in your natural powers. And then also, St. Ignatius invites us to consider the purpose of why the Lord would allow such a trial. And by considering these things, it can be helpful to kind of resist desolation. And so, let's just ponder a little bit more the first thing that Ignatius invites us to consider, that it is a trial. So from the perspective of God, when we go through desolation and the Lord allows this to happen, it's in a sense a trial from the perspective of God. And so when we don't consider this, right, if we're just kind of in desolation, it can seem like a meaningless thing, like, okay, God feels far away, I'm disoriented, things are disoriented, unclear, and if we don't consider the fact that this is a trial, it's heavier, it's a bigger cross. But when we begin to consider, hey, I'm in God's providence, and He who loves me is allowing this to happen, right? One begins to kind of cross a spiritual threshold, right? And one begins to kind of move from a kind of heavy meaninglessness into a sense of meaning and purpose. Even if I don't fully understand why I'm going through this or why I'm experiencing this, there's a sense of the Lord is allowing this to happen and He loves me. And so there's like a new sense of energy to be able to kind of resist and fight, because you can kind of have this sense of trust that there's a plan here, that the Lord is allowing this, that He is indeed present. And so by considering, hey, this is a difficulty that the Lord who loves me is allowing, there's this sense of, again, new hope and meaning to the trial itself. And so that's the first thing that Ignatius invites us to consider, right? Consider, as you're going through desolation, hey, this is the trial. The Lord is allowing this. There's a meaning behind this. Nothing is meaningless regarding the Lord who loves me. So we'll continue with the other things that Ignatius wants us to consider next week.